Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit. Accept no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world. Tonight, we're going to take a look back into history, and we're going to explore the history of Friday the 13th. It is a fascinating topic for sure. You may have wondered in the past where this came from, and you hear various iterations of why there is such a negative connotation attached to the notion of Friday the 13th. Well, this goes back to the story of the Templars and their reckoning day back in 1307. And we're going to explore that history tonight. We're going to be reading from a book titled Dungeon, Fire, and Sword, The Knights Templar in the Crusades by John J. Robinson. I am a little bit of a history nerd, for those of you who don't know me out there, and I have a particular fascination with medieval history. So this is something that has always been of interest to me, and it's something I would like to share with the rest of you out there, because if you don't understand your history, you may be doomed to repeat it. And certainly we can learn some lessons from the story of the reckoning day of the Templars and their Grand Master Jacques de Molay, and we can know a few things about the modern world that relate back to the Templars, because this is foundational to the world today. Whether you realize that or not, maybe you don't know much about the Knights Templar or what they had accomplished and what they had done in the distant past, or how it relates to things going on in the world today. But we're going to explore that avenue of thought, and we're going to look at particularly this notion about Friday the 13th, why it got a negative connotation, what the historical background is of the day, and how we arrive today at this archetype that is Friday the 13th. And I'm doing this show because we had just had a Friday the 13th here in September that has passed now. And if I'm not mistaken, I think there's another Friday the 13th present this year coming up in December. So these are some important connotations to remember. So we have this very short, brief time period wherein falls two Friday the 13th within a couple months span of each other. So this could have some important significance in upcoming events in this world. And of course, if you look smack dab between these two Friday the 13th, you will find the election in November. And we are in an election year, and all the stops will be pulled for certain. I'm not sure what the outcome of everything is going to be, folks, but what I can tell you for certain is it doesn't matter which side wins this election. They're both pre-selected. They work for the same people, and they're not on your team. Let's put it that way. They do not truly represent us anymore, if they ever truly had. That's the bottom line with all of it. So I'm thinking in terms of, we have this archetype of Friday the 13th is present in the current zeitgeist, and maybe there's a type of energetic influence that can be garnered from it by those who seek to sway the direction the world is going to go to within the next couple of months here. And stepping forward into 2025, a lot of things have been predicted for 2025. And we'll see what actually comes to fruition and what takes place. But certainly, the occult signs are all over the place, aren't they? We can take a look around at the world today and understand the pre-echoing of a lot of things that's been put out there in popular media and popular culture. And we can see the negative impacts that much of this stuff has been intended for the bulk of us. Why is every science fiction movie in the modern era a dystopian type science fiction movie? Well, certainly this is the future envisioned by those people who control things in this world, these dark occultists who run things, and their minions just beneath them, the technocrats, these two groups that constitute what is referred to by Michael Hoffman and others as the cryptocracy. And certainly we see they've had their influence in this world, and they do seek to guide things in a certain direction. But we can put a stop to that. We can disempower that by removing our consent from that, by saying, no thank you, we do not want to participate in a dystopia. We would rather do something better. And in order to stave that off, we have some options open to us to do so. I would say probably the most important thing on the immediate horizon that we need to be aware of is the push for a total digital currency. We need to resist that. We need to stick with some type of a physical means of exchange in order to stave off this control system, because that's what it's all about. It's a control system coming in. And this is a major key step that we can take right now to stave off the plans of these technocrats and these elitists and these dark occultists who want to bring in a dystopian world order for yourself and myself. And we don't want that. So we need to maintain some of our freedoms by sticking with a physical form of currency, whether it's a fiat currency or not. Doesn't matter. As long as there's a physical medium of exchange, we can have more freedoms, and we can stave off the coming of this digital panopticon control grid that they want to set in place. So that's an important first step. And the second step we could take along with that goes hand in hand with that, is buy local. Go to local small businesses and do business with them rather than these grand retailers and these big corporations that encompass everything. Pay in cash. Local small businesses and pay in cash. That is an important step we could all take here to stave off the coming social control grid that they want to snap in place. And if enough of us do that, do these small things, we can make a massive difference. And we see a lot of hope in doing that. But the whole point here is these dark controllers in this world, they have a dystopian future in mind. And why is that everything turns to the dark side? Why has this been leveraged against us? And why is it important that we look back in our history at these various groups that have escalated to places of power and prominence in this world and understand what has been leveraged against them, what archetypes they represent? And how does all this relate to the topic tonight, you may ask? What does this have to do with Friday the 13th? Well, the simple answer is everything. Because like I said, we have this confluence of two Friday the 13ths surrounding an election cycle. And these energetic principles are very likely to be manipulated and leveraged by these dark occultists who run things in this world. So it's important we look at this. What actually came as a result of Friday the 13th for the Templars? Now remember, these were the people, by and large, who had a lot of sway and power and influence at the time. And that world order was struck down almost overnight, and a new world order of sorts crept up in its place. But the Templars never truly disappeared. They just engrafted themselves in other places and have since then snuck their way back into positions of authority. And those that struck them down took many of their ideologies and reapplied them with their own agendas attached. And of course, we're speaking of things like central banking. The Templars were the first central bankers, in case you did not know that. So this was an important concept, and this was part of how the normalization of an old sin called usury became commonplace. Now, you would understand this as lending money at interest, and all the banks and institutions today do that, and the credit cards, everything. And now the interest rates are ridiculous. This was a sin, still is considered a sin in the Christian theological context, but it's one that gets overlooked by the modern world because our whole system is based upon debt. And a lot of this was instantiated by the role of the Templars. So you need to understand that in order to see how the foundations of our modern culture have come into being. The Templars were central to a lot of this. So we're going to look at the story of what exactly happened on Friday the 13th and why it's an important historical story to explore. So without further ado, we're going to begin reading. The Templar Grand Master had been summoned to Europe, probably at the instigation of Philip of France, but it took him a year to answer the call. Jacques de Molay wanted to arrive at the papal court fully prepared with a carefully drafted plan for the reconquest of the Holy Land to lay before the Pope, which should earn the gratitude of the pontiff and ensure a prominent role for the Knights Templar. Philip, who had already determined to get his hands on the Templar wealth, could hardly prevail with the Templar leader out of his reach, sitting on a Templar treasury that could be used to bribe allies and to hire thousands of mercenaries. Philip needed to have the Templar master where he could get his hands on him first. What King Philip was planning was dangerous, and if improperly handled, it could unleash forces that could easily turn on the French monarchy. Over a decade had passed since the Templars had decided to abandon their last castles in the Holy Land, and basic changes had taken place during that period. With no need for droves of recruits to be shipped off to the Crusades, the new knights taken into the order tended to stay where they were, and the order in Europe had taken on a posture approaching nationalization. The English master had taken his Templars to war against other Christians, fighting alongside Edward of England against the Scots. In the Spanish kingdoms, where the war against the Muslims was still raging, almost all of the Templars were Spanish. In Portugal, the Temple had agreed with the king that all of the Templars in his kingdom would be Portuguese. In Germany, the Knights Templar under Brother Hugo von Grumbach were almost all Germans. There was a chance that the Temple would split up along nationalistic lines, but if they all worked together under their Grand Master and pooled their men and revenues, as they had done in the Holy Land, they would constitute a major military force. They were experienced at hiring trained mercenaries, but they might not have to. There were a number of monarchs, not the least of whom was Edward I of England, who would happily ally themselves with the Templars against Philip to participate in carving up the corpse of the French monarchy. It was clear that Philip wanted only the Templar properties in France and wanted only his own debts to the Templars abrogated, but to achieve his goals in total security, it would be necessary to suppress the entire order throughout the Christian world, so that it would be destroyed as a military force able to wreak revenge. Gonna pause for a moment here. So King Philip of France, he owed the Templars money. He owed the Templars money. Now think about this. How many noble families of today, or kingdoms of today, owe somebody money, and whom do they owe the money to? Well, the central banks, the central banking interests. These are the ones who have the true power. And this is where a lot of conflict arises from. So the Templars, back in that day, they were the ones whom lent out money to many of these kings, noble people, rulers, and they owed the Templars the money back. So King Philip, he wanted his debts abrogated to the Templars, but he didn't feel safe going about it in the type of way that you would expect. Instead, he devised a plan, because he recognized the threat that the entire Templar order represented to the world, a centralized military force that can pool its resources, vast amounts of resources, and pretty much conquer whatever territories it would like to. He recognized this as a threat not only to his own power, but to the power of others. So he concocted a scheme. Let's read on and see what that all entails. It was a risky prospect and would require skillful handling. Fortunately for Philip, he had some very skilled counselors, well versed in the law and adept at confusing that law. Philip also had a firm grip on the French clergy, whose pulpits were a major avenue of communication with all the people in his kingdom, so the king was not concerned about his ability to get his people on his side. The problem was the rulers and the people of the other Christian kingdoms, who could best be reached and persuaded by the papacy. Just as Philip needed Jacques de Molay to come to France, he had to keep Clement V from leaving. In that he was aided by the fact that the Pope was something of a physical coward, a trait that had helped attract him to Philip's attention in the first place. As a French Pope, he must realize that his life would be in danger from the moment he set foot in Rome, but it wouldn't hurt to keep reminding him of that realistic danger. The Italians were still furious at having lost the papacy to the French, and they were mad enough to kill. The only real safety for the Pope was to stay under the protection of his loyal son and fellow schemer, King Philip the Fair. The danger was real, of course, and would keep a long line of popes away from Rome in what would come to be called the Babylonianish captivity of the papacy, a 75-year period in which not a single pope would run the risk of even a visit to Rome. Clement V would wander around France for a few years, never far from the armed forces of Philip, until in 1309 he would purchase Avignon in Provence from its owner, Joan of Naples, for 80,000 gold florins. There the popes would build a magnificent papal palace and fortress from which to rule their spiritual kingdom. Not that the pope's goals were strictly spiritual. Clement V evidenced an absolute genius for money-making. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So this pope was good for making money. He had some worldly ambitions, didn't he? Someone in years past had come up with the concept of the treasury of the church, sometimes called the treasury of merits. This was the limitless store of merits and blessings bestowed by God on Jesus Christ and his Holy Mother. Since their goodness was infinite, so was the supply of blessings or merits. God had given the Pope the sole control of that treasury, and Clement V opened the doors for a great warehouse sale of those blessings. For sale were satisfaction of penances, partial or total remission of sins, reversals of decrees of excommunication, curtailment of years in purgatory for the already dead and the to-be dead, which included everyone, Papal honors went on the block along with exemptions and annulments. Everything was for sale, and all was pure profit, since what was being sold cost nothing. Clement V invented annates, fees of up to 100% of the gross revenues for every church benefice granted to a new holder upon the death of the incumbent. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So in those times, in the Catholic Church, it was very much considered that the Pope was the primary representative of Christ on earth and had the power to forgive sins and various other things. And this Pope put all that up for sale for a price. This is part of the ugly background of the Christian Church. Sadly enough, and many people get a bad taste in their mouth over things like this, and it still goes on to a certain degree in the modern era. If you give enough money, well, then the church will give you favor. If you donate enough money, they'll look upon you with favor. And of course, it may not be the same as claiming you could forgive them of their sins and they can buy penance and all of this stuff through that giving, like was given here, but certainly we see the reflection of that in the modern era, in the organized church body, and the big mainline churches and other religious organizations of today. These people falsely claim they can forgive sins and can have some type of a spiritual effect on the other side of things here, and will absolutely do that for you if you pay them enough money. We see a lot of this. And this ties back to that time. So you see all the parties involved in this whole scheme that happened in the Templar history were somehow or another compromised in one way, shape, or form. Pope Clement wasn't exactly a saint, let's be honest about it. Apparently, he had some worldly desires, and he had some ulterior motives to the things he did. And certainly King Philip, the same thing can be said, King Philip the Fair of France. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Templars were the innocent party. And sometimes that's the paintbrush they get painted with, because a lot of the historians who cover this are very much pro-Templar. They want to represent the secret society groups in the best possible light, because many of them are members themselves. So sometimes we get a rather skewed version of the story. I'm not sure if that holds true in this case of where we're reading from, but we'll see as we continue through to see what is revealed and what is not revealed. So let's read on here. The money showed up in magnificent robes decorated with gold and jewels, luxurious furnishings, thousands of servants, solid gold table services, and elaborate ceremonies and pageantry. Clement V wallowed in his newfound wealth that was beyond anything he had ever dared fantasize. For Philip of France, who desperately needed money for his own kingdom, watching the flow of treasure into the papacy could only renew his determination to satisfy his own needs. With de Nogaret and his other counselors, he led a plan that was a kind of dress rehearsal for the arrest and suppression of the Templars. The target was the Jews of France, who would have few defenders. Secret orders were sent to all the seneschals of France in every corner of the country. They gave the command that every Jew in France was to be arrested and imprisoned at the same time on July 22nd, 1306. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. 22nd, 22. The number of the master builder. Present even back in 1306. And you see, this was a practice run for rounding up the Templars. Instead, they started with the Jews in France. Now, why did King Philip do this? Well, let's read on and see if we can garner any information about this. Why did they target the Jews? Interesting. All of their records and their properties were seized to become the property of the crown. Then the Jews were sent off into exile, destitute and homeless. Their property was inventoried and gathered for auction to the benefit of the crown, while the records were combed for debt instruments. All documents recording debts owed by the Crown of France were destroyed. All other monies owed to the Jews were now ordered to be payable to the King of France, who mounted an aggressive drive for their collection. As the king had expected, no one made any attempt to stop him. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So, even back then, in the year 1306 in France, the Jews were looked down upon by a lot of the people. They weren't well respected or liked, so nobody cared when the king arrested them and stole their wealth from them and sent them into exile, sent them away from France. So, did he see them as an easy target for a test run? Potentially, yes. And this was one way for him to further prop up his own coffers, his own wealth, by stealing theirs and destroying any notes of indebtedness he may have to some Jewish businesses or anything of the sort. So this is what he did. And this happened in 1306, the year prior to the arrest of the Templars. Now let's read on and see how this actually panned out. Such a move against the Christian Templars was exactly what Philip had in mind, but it would be much more complicated because any Christian had legal protection not available to the Jews. In addition, the Templars were exempt from all secular law, responsible only to the Pope. Their suppression would have to be based on offenses against God and against the canons and customs of the Church. The charge of heresy was a must, because it called for the confiscation of property. Other sins could be trotted out in order to thoroughly blacken the Templar name, as in the accusations of sodomy, blasphemy, and witchcraft hurled at Pope Boniface VIII, but heresy must play the major role. Nor was it enough to prove the guilt of individual Templars. If found guilty of heresy, they had no personal property to confiscate. And if 50 individual Templars were found guilty of all manner of sins and crimes, they could be punished, even executed, without affecting the ongoing operations of the order. It was absolutely vital to a successful suppression and seizure of property that the order itself be found guilty of those sins and crimes. If an individual knight held heretical beliefs or engaged in any heretical practices, it must be shown that they were forced upon him by the Templar rule or by his superior officers, so that the order itself was the guilty party and the individual Templar simply the victim of an evil organization. Gonna pause for a moment here. So King Philip thought this through very thoroughly. He knew he had to go digging to find heresy present within the Templar order, and wouldn't you know, it wasn't all that difficult to find. Because if you've listened to this broadcast in the past, you know a little bit of something about the Templars and what they did in secret within the secure walls of their secret temple. You may know a little something about some of the practices that were done. Now, many a scholar might claim there's nothing to these claims except for the false confessions of the Templars because of this plan of King Philip. But there is actual evidence to show that perhaps they had performed blasphemies, they had performed some of the secret rites and rituals that are inherent in all the mystery schools, that they were indeed themselves a type of mystery school at the innermost sanctum of the Templars, and that these things were indeed present. So let's continue and see what else that this mainstream historical narrative tells us, because this is very much by and large a mainstream historical narrative that is presented in this book. This is accepted history. So there's no conspiracy theory or anything at play here. Philip was encouraged by the fact that the one crime that allowed confiscation of property, the crime of heresy, might be the easiest to prove, regardless of guilt or innocence. The Church approved, and sometimes even insisted on, the use of torture to extract confessions of heresy. Concepts born during the Albigensian Crusade had been refined, defined, and well organized during the years since the Holy Roman and Universal Inquisition had been established by Pope Gregory IX in 1229 during the suppression of the Cathars in southern France. The Inquisition, from the Latin inquire, to look into, was largely based on the legal point that the most conclusive evidence possible was a confession. In the pursuit of the purification of the faith, it was reasoned that the use of torture was a legitimate means to extract such a confession, since God would enable the innocent to bear up under any amount of pain, even when induced by practiced experts at all the refinements of generating human agony. The next important legal point established was that a confession extracted under even the most hideous torture was valid and extremely significant, non-retractable. Any person who confessed under torture and then retracted that confession when the torture stopped was labeled a relapsed heretic. The relapsed heretic was conclusively and irretrievably guilty and was summarily handed over to the secular authorities, who had no choice but to burn the guilty party at the stake. The Knights Templar would learn all of these things firsthand during the coming months and years, and they would suffer under the frustration of yet another legal aspect of the Inquisition, that the accused had no right to know the identity of his accuser, nor of anyone who witnessed or gave evidence against him. Since Philip's objective was to prove that the Templar order was guilty of heresy, the whole machinery of the Inquisition could be put to work for him. There was only one obstacle. As a religious order, the Knights Templar were exempt from the application of torture. A way around that exemption would have to be found. The best idea seemed to be to use the technique used so successfully against the Jews. Arrest the Templars in France, all at one time. Then the torture could be applied immediately to extract some confessions of guilt before anyone could make a formal objection. The confessions would justify the action, but Philip would need the cooperation of the Inquisition. That wouldn't be too difficult to arrange. The Grand Inquisitor for France, Dominican brother Guillaume Imbert, was Philip's friend and personal confessor, and had frequently benefited from the royal largesse. In all of this, a factor in Philip's favor would be the Knights Templars' love of secrecy. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. And this is one of the keys to all of this. One of the reasons why it would appear that some of the charges against the Templars had some actual merits to them. Because, you see, they did conceal secrets. What good comes from secrecy? Let's be honest about that. Why do these secret society groups keep secrets? Now, there is a distinction to be made between what's known as arcane and what is known as secret. Secrecy, in and of itself, is used to conceal something that's bad or has some ill motivation behind it. Now, something that is arcane is hidden in plain sight. Well, this is certainly not the case with most secret society groups anymore. They will claim that it's arcane knowledge, and that's the nature of the secrecy. But this is something totally different and has been misconstrued for a long time within the occult fraternities. They keep secrets in order to maintain power. It is not so that, or simply because the public is too ignorant to recognize what's hidden in the esoteric meaning of a thing. No, that's not the case at all. They knowingly keep secrets from people. They keep information from people, and it's not that it's arcane in nature. It's just it helps them to maintain their facade of power. So it would seem that this whole notion of secrecy is part of the problem here. The Templars, they kept secrets, and this was used against them. So let's read on, and we'll see what happened here next within the story. All of their chapter meetings were conducted in total secrecy, usually at night, with Templar sentries outside the door with drawn swords. Their initiation ceremonies and rituals, whatever they might be, had always been cloaked in mystery. That enabled all manners of rumors to rise up from time to time, such as whispered reports that someone trying to eavesdrop on a Templar meeting had been killed, or that a Templar knight who revealed what happened at his own initiation had been murdered by his Templar brothers. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now all of this doesn't sound too far outside the bounds of possibility here when you understand and have seen what it is that goes on in organizations like Freemasonry. Perhaps the same thing was going on with the Templars. It seems likely, in fact. The cloak of secrecy also covered the rule of the order, which was revealed to the knight on a need-to-know basis, and he was sworn to reveal no part of the rule known to him under the threat of severe disciplinary measures. It was thought that no more than a dozen or so of the highest officers of the order were familiar with the entire rule. As always happens, their secrecy had aroused feelings from idle curiosity to envy and anger. It would work to Philip's benefit because he could unleash a wide variety of accusations against the Knights Templar, which no one outside the order could oppose on the basis of any personal knowledge. And I'm going to pause again for a moment here. So all of this also sounds familiar with modern secret societies, doesn't it? So it seems likely that this is exactly how the Templars operated as well. All these same things are present in modern-day Freemasonry and the other occult fraternities as well. So when you understand the roots of where this all comes from, and you trace it back to the ancient mystery schools, and understand that the Knights Templar were in and of themselves a type of mystery school of sorts, then you begin to understand that there was, perhaps, some merits to these accusations. Now, maybe some of it had been exaggerated, maybe some of it had been trumped up, but I think there was a kernel of truth to some of the accusations, and I think Philip the Fair leveraged that to fit his own agenda and his own personal accomplishments. So let's read on here. Just what those accusations would be, or what questions would be put to the Templars on the rack, were still undecided, but they took shape when an Italian criminal informer named Arnolfo Deghi, who had performed several special missions for William de Nogaret, introduced him to a renegade ex-Templar named Esquire de Florian. Arnolfo Deghi had performed a valuable service for de Nogaret in 1300, when he presented accusations of sorcery and magic against the Bishop of Troyes. So he had a fair idea of what de Nogaret was looking for to use against the Templars. Esquire de Florian had risen in the ranks of the Knights Templar to become the prior of the Templar preceptory at Montfaucon in the region of Perigueux. But for some lost reason, he was removed from office and returned to the ranks. His attempts to get the provincial master to restore him to a position of authority were completely unsuccessful, so he let his anger drive him to punish the superior, who could not be persuaded. Dagger drawn, he waited one night in the shadows and leaped out to stab the master to death. His own death would be the inevitable punishment, so he ran, apparently to Spain. A letter from de Florian to the King of Aragon was discovered generations later in the royal archives at Barcelona. It recites de Florian's attempt to provide information condemning the Templars in exchange for payment out of the property that would be confiscated from the order. The King of Aragon had not been convinced by de Florian's accusations against the Templars and declined to move against them, but as de Florian reminded the king in his letter, quote, "You must remember, sir, that on my withdrawal from your chamber at Lerida, you promised me that if the affair of the Templars was discovered to be true, you would give me out of their property £1,000 per year in rents and £3,000 in money." End quote. The principal purpose of the letter was expressed as, quote, "When the opportunity arises, deign to remember this," end quote. There was no money coming from Aragon, so de Florian undoubtedly leaped at the chance to earn a reward from France. He would do whatever it took, and de Nogaret was too shrewd to rely simply on a public statement of accusations against the Templars that had no ring of authenticity. He decided to stage a drama far from Paris that would have the appearance of bringing the Templar crimes to King Philip's attention totally by accident. De Guy and de Florian were sent to occupy a cell together in the prison at Toulouse, de Nogaret's former home, where he had attended the university and still had many friends. Pretending a desire to confess their sins, the two prisoners, by arrangements, were denied the services of a priest, so taking advantage of the church rule that permitted a Catholic with no access to a priest to confess to another Catholic layman, they heard each other's confessions. As a former Templar, de Florian unburdened himself of a battery of Templar sins based on greed, treachery, sorcery, homosexuality, and heresy. De Guy, confined under an assumed name, feigned shock and revulsion at the revelations and demanded that they be presented to the king. The prison officials, who had to have been in on the play acting, arranged for the information to be passed to the royal court. Now, de Nogaret had a document and a witness. He had a reason to arrest the Templars and a basis for questions that would be asked under torture. His authority could be drawn from the decrees of the Second Lateran Council, which had demanded that the secular authority root out and chastise heretics, and that all secular princes cooperate in every way with the Holy Roman Inquisition. The stage was set. All that was needed now was the star player, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So it seems many pains were taken to make these arrangements. Now, you did have some disgruntled Templars making claims. Of course, he made these claims prior to this to somebody else who didn't listen. So does it mean what he was saying was absolutely false? No, I don't think it was. In fact, when you explore a lot of the side trails that connect to the Templars and the things they were doing in the temple, you find much of what this guy was talking about present. The evidence thereof, and of course you see some of these same things practiced in secret societies today. So if there's nothing to it, then why does it still persist? That's a big question we must ask ourselves. So the Templars, in my estimation, in my view, I don't think they were totally innocent of all of this. But I do think perhaps there were some exaggerations and trumped-up charges added to the whole pile in order for the king to get what he wanted, and in order for Pope Clement to get what he wanted as well. But we'll see as we continue through this what all came into being in actuality here. After a year of crusade planning, Grand Master Jacques de Molay was on his way to France. The Grand Master of the Hospitallers had also been commanded to appear, but he begged off on the grounds that his order was at war with the infidel, fighting to take the island of Rhodes, so that he could not always be away at this time. That was fine with de Molay, who was just as happy to be the only Grand Master at the papal court to fight off another threat to the Templar order, a movement to combine the Templars and Hospitallers into a single order. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now we have this connection of the Knights Hospitallers too, or the Knights of St. John. Hospitallers. This is another interesting organization, and see what was going on was they wanted to merge these two organizations together into one. And the Templars were opposed, and I'm sure probably the Hospitallers were opposed to that as well. Well, the problem with all of that is, see, at the highest, most levels, all of these secret society groups and all of these occult fraternities and orders are interconnected, and they are indeed the same group. At the very topmost levels, and the teachings are the same across the board with all of them. So the external appearances are only a small portion of this, and certainly they wanted to have the appearance of diversity, when in actuality it's all uniformity behind the scenes with all of it. Same could be said of all these secret society groups and orders today. The Jesuits, the Freemasons, although they appear to be the staunchest of adversaries on the surface level, behind the scenes they all teach the same things and are working towards the same goals, and sometimes they disagree on how to get there, but they do work together, folks. That's one of the big secrets at the heart of all of this. It's all part of the stage production, part of controlling both sides of any given narrative, the Hegelian control mechanism in play, like always. Same thing going on here, and they had their own reasons for wanting to oppose this proposal of unifying these two orders. So let's continue on. A few years earlier, a priest and a lawyer named Pierre de Bois had written his own plan for the recovery of the Holy Land called De Recuperation Terra Sanctae, in which he had recommended and cited the efficiencies that would result from a merger of the Templars and Hospitallers. More recently, a Dominican named Raymond Lull had written a much more detailed plan for the organization of the crusading effort. He proposed that the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem and the Knights of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem should be combined into one military order to be called the Knights of Jerusalem. Similarly, he had suggested that all of the secular crusaders be brought together under one commander to be called the Rex Bellator, or the War King. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Rex Bellator, the War King. That's an interesting title, isn't it? And all the mercenaries would be brought under the banner of the War King. During these crusades, this was the plan put forward by Lull. Let's read on. The Pope's reaction to the merger concept was favorable, perhaps because the Hospitallers were gaining new respect from their attack on Rhodes, or perhaps because the order appeared much less controversial. Clement V favored Folques de Villeray, the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, to become the Grand Master of the combined orders. As for Philip of France, such a combination would not solve his money troubles unless he could somehow control the treasury and the debt portfolio of the merged orders. His response was that the kings of France should be named the hereditary Grand Masters of the proposed combination of orders, and that he should personally be appointed the Rex Bellator, with full authority over and access to the combined treasuries of the merged orders. No one liked his idea. I'm going to pause for a moment here. Boy, this guy was money hungry, wasn't he? This King Philip the Fair, he had a lot of ambition, didn't he? He wanted to be Rex Bellator, the War King, and he wanted to control the coffers of both of these organizations, both the Hospitallers and the Knights Templar. Boy, this guy had some ambition, and it didn't seem like people liked that idea very much. Gee, I wonder why. Let's read on, though. This was the situation Jacques de Molay sailed into in 1307, in the early part of 1307, as his fleet of 6 Templar galleys put into the harbor at Marseille. His orders from the Pope had been to come directly to the papal court at Poitiers and to travel incognito, but those instructions did not suit his personality, nor his perception of his personal importance. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. It's not in his idiom. I'm thinking, of course, in terms of the Monty Python movie, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's not in his idiom. Idiom, sir? Yes, idiom. Sorry, I had to add that in there. But that's what I'm thinking of. So Jacques de Molay, it was below his station to be humble and to carry on incognito. So let's keep that in mind. And perhaps this was part of the whole downfall of all of this, too. It's the hubris. You see, the arrogance and the hubris of these people who think themselves so important. So let's read on here. So those instructions did not suit his personality nor his perception of his personal importance. He ignored the Pope's directives and marched to his temple fortress at Paris in a medieval parade of power with a personal escort of 60 knights in red-crossed snow-white robes with banners flying, accompanied by their black-robed squires and sergeants, a contingent of servants, and a pack train that included 12 horses bearing a treasure of over 150,000 gold florins. Incredibly, the proud gray-bearded master who led the parade had no idea what he was riding into. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. All the pomp and circumstance, and he was riding to be arrested and eventually killed by the King of France and the Pope. He had no idea. Jacques de Molay. This guy is highly revered by Freemasons. He was clueless. He marched into his own destruction with pomp and circumstance because of his hubris and his pride. He was instructed by the Pope, go incognito. He didn't listen. He marched himself and a whole bunch of other people right to their destruction, didn't he? Let's read on. To the contrary, he anticipated a warm welcome by Philip of France, who would surely express his gratitude to the Grand Master for many past favors. Just the year before, Philip had fled from a bloodthirsty mob, angry at the king for debasing the national currency. He had sought refuge in the Paris temple, where the Knights Templar had guarded his royal person for 3 full days until the riot died down. The Templars had loaned the king the money he needed for the dowry of his sister, and more recently the money required for the betrothal of his daughter to the English Prince of Wales. When asked, they had guarded crown jewels and treasury of France. Grand Master de Molay had broken the rule of his order to act as godfather to Philip's infant son, Robert. Surely Philip could do no less to express his gratitude than to support the Templars in putting aside the plan to merge their order with the Hospitallers and to help them to gain a prominent role in the planning of the next crusade. It seemed to de Molay that all was going as he expected when he was invited to the royal court, where the assembled nobility of France heard the warm words of praise and welcome heaped upon the unsuspecting Grand Master by Philip the Fair. At the Paris temple, Jacques de Molay told the local officers of his plans for the next crusade and the arguments he would present to the Pope to thwart the attempt to merge the military orders. In return, they told the Grand Master about the recent spate of rumors of improprieties and sinful conduct within the Templar order. They agreed that the best way to put the rumors to rest was for the Grand Master to ask Clement V for a formal papal inquiry. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now we see the political machinations going on, all the officialdom going on with this. So de Molay, the head of the order, wanted the Pope to go ahead and begin an investigation into these claims, and he thought things would pan out in his favor, because you see, de Molay was already tight with King Philip the Fair, which makes this all the more treacherous, really, when it comes down to it. And he seemed to have a good relationship with Clement V as well. So he was thinking, even if there was something nefarious going on within the Templar order, his buddies would brush it under the rug, much like happens in the political theater we see today, and nothing would ever come of it, and all of it would just disappear into the annals of history. But that's not exactly what happened, is it? Let's read on. In the belief that he was now fully prepared, de Molay made the trip to the papal court, where he was received by a group of high church officials, but not by the Pope himself. Concerning the next crusade, he had detailed but incomplete plans, because, as he explained, he felt that the definitive plans for the actual invasion should be established as a carefully guarded secret and not committed to writing. As to his own secret plans that would absolutely assure the success of the crusade, those he would reveal only in the person to the Pope alone. As expected, the subject of the proposed merger of the military orders was brought up, and de Molay was ready. He presented a formal document entitled De Unione Templi et Hospitalis Ordinum ad Clementis Papam Jacobi de Malayo Relatio, a treatise that he had to trust contained his own arguments, since de Molay could not read or write his own native French, much less the Latin of the Church. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So does this guy really sound all that smart? So he's trusting that somebody wrote up this document correctly for him, this important document, and he couldn't even read it. So he doesn't know if it's truly representing his ideas or his best interests. And it seems that this litany of errors on his part began to spell out his own demise, didn't they? As to the ridiculous rumors about his holy fraternity, the Grand Master expressed his supreme confidence that even the most cursory papal inquiry would find those allegations to be totally unfounded, the products of ignorance and envy. He left the meeting pleased that he had met and successfully handled every issue put to him. As the Grand Master was presenting his plans, de Nogaret was proceeding with his own plan to bring him down and his entire order with him. Reportedly, a dozen men had been recruited to seek membership in the Templar order and to report back on their initiation rites. But if true, that effort produced nothing usable. The confession of Esqui de Florian was beginning to prove its value. The weeks went by, with the aging Grand Master very happy with himself, his order, and the world as he found it. As summer came on, events started to heat up, but they didn't stir de Molay to any action. The anti-Templar rumors were growing stronger, and there had to be some knowledge that trouble was brewing. When a Templar told Hugh de Parade that he was planning to leave the order, de Parade encouraged his resignation and told him to act with dispatch, because a catastrophe for the order was imminent. De Parade was a good friend of Philip and a bitter rival to Jacques de Molay, who had defeated him in the Grand Master election. And he may well have been privy to Philip's thoughts, if not his plans. With no recorded explanation, the Paris master sent an order to every Templar preceptory in France to tighten security and to reveal nothing to anyone regarding the secret rituals or meetings of the order. Several former Templars were taken into the protective custody of the crown, apparently in the fear that they would be murdered if it was suspected that they might discuss what went on in the secret meetings of the order. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So all of this most certainly suggests that perhaps the Templars were not innocent of all of this after all. Wouldn't you think? What are they hiding? Obviously they were hiding something. Let's read on. Perhaps all these items and more were brought to the attention of the Grand Master. He would be justified in hearing them without fear, since the Templar order was subject only to the Pope, and not to any secular monarch, nor to the laws of any land. As members of a holy order, the Templars were exempt from torture, and to top it all, they had a strong and experienced fighting force backed by chests of gold. What could they possibly have to fear? I'm going to pause again. So these were people who were so used to being above reproach and above the law, and don't we see that present in our world today? There are groups of people who seemingly are above the law in this way, and I think this needs to be a lesson to those people who view themselves as being above the law, that perhaps their reckoning day may be coming sometime soon as well as happened to Jacques de Molay and the Knights Templar here. They were untouchable. They were the untouchables of their time. And yet, somehow, somebody with a little bit of ambition and a bent on revenge against these people decided to somehow infuriate the public about this organization and set in motion a plan that brought them down in a big historical way. So let that be a lesson from history, perhaps to those hubristic and prideful people who think they're part of this class of people in this society that are above the law or beyond reproach, that they can't be held accountable for their actions, that they have too much sway and power and influence to be held liable for their actions, or they know too many of the big secrets for the others to let that happen to them. I think you're mistaken, and I think we see something similar going on right now with the arrest of one Mr. P. Diddy. And of course, we've seen the same thing with a Jeffrey Epstein and the likes as well. Let it be a lesson for some of you clowns out there who think that you're a different grade of person than the rest of us, that you're somehow beyond the touch of the law, that the things you do won't come back to haunt you. They most certainly will. And this is an example of that. But let's go ahead and we'll read on. Then in July, de Nogaret was able to bring wonderful news to his sovereign lord. Edward I of England was dead. The man who could have done the most to thwart Philip's plans, a good friend to the Knights Templar, a cool fox at the bargaining table, and a raging tiger on the battlefield, the best king England ever had, was dead. And better still, he was now replaced by a weak-willed young man who was totally enthralled by his handsome homosexual lover. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. And now you're beginning to see some of the writing on the wall with this historical event. The reckoning day of the Templars. Now you know why they like to see weak leaders in various places. Let's read on. There was nothing to fear from Edward II, whose father had been such a constant source of concern. The continental wars against England must be revitalized, and seizing the treasure of the Templars was now more important than ever. Philip went to the Pope in a great show of reluctance and emotional stress, regretting his duty to present to the Holy Father the shameful evidence of Templar corruption and heresy that had fallen into his hands. A former Templar officer had confessed it all, he moaned, as he produced the confessions of Esqui de Florian. The Templars put their order and its selfish interest before the interests of Holy Mother Church and before moral principle. They took a secret oath to defend and enrich their order by any means, without regard for right or wrong. They maintained secret correspondence with the Muslims. In their initiation rites, new members were required to spit or trample on the cross and to deny Jesus Christ. A Templar who attempted to reveal the secrets of the order was murdered. The Templars desecrated the holy sacraments and omitted the words of consecration in the service of the Mass. They practiced the absolution of sins by laymen without a priest. The Templars were given permission to engage in sodomy and other homosexual acts. It was through the treachery of the Templars that the Holy Land had been lost. They worshipped satanic idols in the forms of a bearded head and a cat. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now you have King Philip the Fair of France going to the Pope and laying all this on the Pope, acting as if he's shocked and surprised and upset about this. And I'm sure the Pope knew it was an act. And I'm sure many of these same things were probably going on behind the scenes within the papacy, especially considering this Pope that we're talking about, Clement V, his historical background, and the things he was doing. And of course, King Philip was not exactly an innocent player in all of this either, was he? But all of these ideas, these charges were brought up against the Templars. And it would seem there are some other third-party sources that verify some of this. Certainly we see they worshipped satanic idols like the bearded head and a cat. This is a reference to what was later called Baphomet. Baphomet, which was turned into an iconic picture by Eliphas Levi. And this is present in the modern era, and it has to do with the absolute inversion principle of everything. Of course, this is a goat-headed being, dual-sexed goat-headed being, showing the as above, so below. And this is part of the heresy laid at the feet of the Templars. Now, it is said by some people who study these things that the bearded head that they worshipped was the head of actually St. John. St. John the Baptist. Was it the Baptist, though, or was it St. John the Revelator? Or St. John the Evangelist? You see, in Freemasonry, they regard both of these figures as one and the same being. The connotation is there, the archetype is there. But it said this was the head of John the Baptist. By some people who research this, this is what they believe to have happened. And that this was at the heart of a lot of this Baphomet worship that went on within the inner sanctum of the Templars. But let's read on and see what else we can see here in the historical narrative. Let's continue. That was a great deal for the Pope to digest at one time. He apparently had strong doubts as to the truth of the accusations, but he did promise the king that he would mount a formal papal inquiry into the charges. It was not all that Philip had hoped for, but it did provide him a point on which to act. By arresting the Templars, he would merely be instigating the inquiry that the Pope had called for, as might be expected of a true servant of the Church. Early in September, folks. Remember, September. Do you remember September? Early in September, orders went out to every seneschal of France to organize a military force on the evening of October 12th, but, on pain of severe punishment, not to open and read until the time the sealed secret orders enclosed. On September 22nd, here we go, perhaps with some knowledge of what was about to transpire, the Archbishop of Narbonne, the king's chancellor, resigned his post and returned the Great Seal. In his place, Philip named his faithful servant, William de Nogaret, the excommunicated lawyer, orphaned by the Church and dedicated only to the interests of his secular sovereign, took the highest office in the land as the king's chancellor. His new dignity did not prevent de Nogaret from personally addressing the logistical problems of the pending mass arrest of the Knights Templar, arrests that would include sergeants, men-at-arms, stewards, craftsmen, and servants of the order. Armed with his new authority, he completed his plans to provide prisons and chains for thousands of men in all parts of the 150,000 square miles of the Kingdom of France. A small army of scribes was put to work making copies of the allegations against the Templars that would be circulated throughout France on the day of the arrests to calm the fears of the people and to gain their sympathy for the project. With so many people involved in the preparations, it seems impossible that no news of their impending disaster reached the Grand Master, but he appears to have been totally relaxed. He was even honored the day before his downfall when he was asked to join the highest nobility of France in acting as a pallbearer at the funeral of Princess Catherine, the deceased wife of Philip's brother Charles of Valois. As de Molay returned to his palace after that day of somber service in the company of kings, dukes, and counts, the seneschals throughout France were opening their sealed orders as the knights and soldiers they had assembled waited to learn what duties they were about to carry out for their king. And I'm going to pause for a moment here. So King Philip the Fair, he kept de Molay thinking that he was being honored by the king that he was friends with the king, and he used flattery to keep de Molay clueless about what was coming. Even if de Molay had heard rumors, he probably thought that's not possible. I'm tight with the king, I'm tight with the pope. I'll be all good. Was he all good, though? Let's see what happened next. It was not the way of medieval kings to explain or justify their orders to minor officials, but there may well have been some fear that some local seneschal or even local knights summoned by him would have formed friendships with Templars in their local preceptories, and so be inclined to modify their orders or to postpone action until the startling commands could be confirmed. Just to make certain that every seneschal would understand the orders, the reasons for those orders, and especially the need to carry them out, de Nogaret had composed a letter of explanation. Such a communication to a seneschal from his king was such an extraordinary event that the mere fact of the explanation was a point of drama and proof of the seriousness of the matter at hand. And it says here, quote, "A bitter thing, a lamentable thing, a thing horrible to think of, too terrible to hear, a detestable crime, an execrable evil deed, an abominable work, a detestable disgrace, a thing wholly inhuman, foreign to all humanity, has, thanks to the reports of several persons worthy of faith, reached our ears, not without striking us with great astonishment and causing us to tremble with violent horror." End quote. And on in the same vein the letter went. The letter does finally get to the point with the order that, quote, "All the members of the said Templar order will be arrested without exception, imprisoned, and reserved for the judgment of the church." End quote. To get right to the reason for this incredible exercise, it continued, quote, "All their movable and unmovable property will be seized, placed in our hands, and faithfully preserved." End quote. The phrase "for the judgment of the church" was defined with orders to immediately call in the good friars of the Inquisition, who were to question the captive Templars as to their alleged crimes, using torture if necessary. And so it was at the dawn of the following day, Friday, the 13th in October of 1307, that almost every Templar knight, priest, sergeant, and servant in France was arrested and put in chains. The arresting party at the Paris Temple was led by the King's Chancellor in person, probably to assure admittance. The date was ever after regarded as an ominous time, but although for the rest of the world it might become an amusing superstition, for the Knights Templar that Friday the 13th was the unluckiest day of that or any other year. Their torture began on that same day. Gonna pause right here. So now you know a little bit of the history of Friday the 13th, the Templar Reckoning Day. Now, it is my view from all of the research that I've done through the years that the Templars weren't necessarily innocent in a lot of this, that many of the accusations were likely true, but you can see how the other interest groups in this story were also not innocent in the whole thing. Nobody had the moral high ground here. Let's be honest about that. This was all the political machinations of things going on and all of this fighting for the wealth and resources and the ability to control that. That's what went on. Let's continue a little bit further into the story here, because that's only the beginning, really. There were not enough prisons available for the sudden influx of thousands of men in chains, so makeshift facilities were called into play. Many of the Templars, such as those seized at the Paris Temple, were confined in their own buildings. Every one of those buildings was searched and relieved of any portable items of value. Most welcome to Philip were the chests of gold and silver coins, and the gold and silver religious objects on the altars, of which the most famous was the gold jeweled covered reliquary holdings of the Templars' own splinter of the true cross, Other items, such as furniture, ornaments, hangings, weapons, and horses, could be stored where they were. Since the buildings were now held by the forces of Philip the Fair, those items could be removed at leisure. The only disappointment resulting from the careful searches was the failure to turn up the idols and satanic symbols that would have provided concrete evidence of heretical guilt. A silver head was found with small bones inside, which appeared to have been made to house holy relics. A legend says that a few days before the arrests, a wagon load of hay had been driven out of the temple, carrying precious possessions to safety, but no testimony or documentation exists to take the story out of the world of Templar myth. Gonna pause for a moment here, and much the same is said in other circles and in other stories surrounding modern-day Freemasonry and the like, that some of the Templars escaped with some of the treasures and took to the sea. And this, according to some, is the origins as to why pirates use the Jolly Roger flag with the skull and the crossbones. It was known, and it is known, it's historically documented, that the Templars, when they buried their knights, they put them in ossuaries where they would put the skull and the two large femur bones crossed in an X-type formation in the ossuary. And this is where the symbol comes from. It's a Masonic symbol now. It was a Templar symbol, and it became a symbol of the pirates. So this is where the legend of the Jolly Roger flag comes from. It comes from the Knights Templar when they took to the sea, and they were escaping arrest. They went into hiding, and many of them were skilled sailors, and it's said some of them escaped from France with some of the more valuable treasures. And that's backed up here in this historical claim. Of course, they say there's no real proof or documentation of this. It's just a Templar myth. Well, a lot of these things are held up as myth within the secret society groups and the occult fraternities, aren't they? There's no written record per se, unless it's in their secret trove of written records. And those do exist as well, according to the secret schools. Let's continue, and we're going to wrap up here very soon. Chancellor de Molay had ordered that the torture of the Templars proceed immediately to get the fast confessions needed to confront the Pope. That activity was turned over to Grand Inquisitor Imbert, assisted by Philip's own jailers and executioners. Now that that deed was done, de Molay had a complete propaganda program to put into effect. Letters went from Philip to all of the Christian monarchs explaining the French king's actions and urging all rulers faithful to the church to follow his example. An especially strong letter and a personal envoy went to young Edward II of England, who was scheduled to become King Philip's son-in-law just 3 months later. Boy, this guy had some ambition, didn't he? Announcements went to every diocese in France to be read from the pulpits on Sunday, October 15th. On that same day, de Molay met with the clergy of Notre Dame Cathedral to encourage their support. He also met with the masters, the clerical faculty of the University of Paris, to explain the king's actions. Other bulletins cataloging the sins of the Templars were distributed to king's officers in all parts of France to be read in councils and in the public squares and markets. When the news of the Templar arrests arrived at the papal court, Clement V was furious. The entire proceedings had been the most flagrant flouting of papal authority. The Church had established the Order of the Temple, which reported only to the Holy Father himself. No one, regardless of rank, title, or motivation, had any right whatsoever to lay hands on the persons or the property of the Knights Templar without the specific permission of the Supreme Pontiff. He turned loose the full fury of the papal wrath on the guilty king. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So King Philip the Fair had now incited the wrath of the Pope upon himself by undertaking this action plan that he put into play here. So you can see now, this is an event that had some very deep-rooted consequences in our history. Philip responded by launching a propaganda assault against Clement V. Announcements were published all over France condemning the Pope for his lenience in the treatment of heretics, for his intention to take all of the Templar wealth for himself and his family, and for his protection of the enemies of God and his holy church. As king and pope thundered against each other, Philip went to the papal court backed by a small army. The Pope reminded the king that a papal letter had gone to him 2 months before in which the Pope had clearly stated that he did not believe the charges against the Templars. In rejoinder, Philip claimed a clear remembrance of the Pope's reaction when the king had presented those charges. He claimed that Clement had said, quote, "My son, you must look into their deeds with diligent care and report to me what you make of them," end quote. The king was simply conducting the inquiry the Pope had called for. Clement replied that he had meant a quiet inquiry by a papal commission, not arrest and torture. Philip's answer was that proper papal decrees absolutely required secular princes to extend every assistance to the Holy Roman Inquisition, which was exactly what he was doing. Clement's answer was to remove Guillaume Imbert from his post as Grand Inquisitor of France. The argument raged for several weeks, with Philip's knights and soldiers strolling about menacingly in their role of overt saber-rattling. A deal was obviously made, with terms we shall probably never know, but the secret sessions of the Pope and King resulted in a singleness of purpose, with Philip achieving full papal approval and cooperation. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks, and this is always how the power structure in this world operates. They make secret backroom deals that aren't necessarily recorded anywhere publicly, and they come to agreement over this. So it's the same thing going on here. Obviously, they didn't agree on how to get there, but they both wanted to put an end to the Templars and to acquire all of their resources for themselves. And they came to some agreement on how this was done. Now let's read on, and we're going to wrap it up here. On November 22nd, oh, that's an interesting date, isn't it? 11/22. On November 22nd, Clement V promulgated the bulls Pastoralis Preeminente, in which he lavished praises on Philip of France as a true son of the Church and loyal defender of the faith. The bull formally recognized the truth of the charges against the Templars and charged all Christian sovereigns to arrest the Templars in their territories and to cause them to be tortured for confessions of heresy. A secular king, as well as the supreme priest, Clement V, followed his own orders by calling for the immediate arrest of all the Knights Templar in the papal lands who were to be turned over to the Inquisition officers there. As part of the agreement, Philip's friend, the Dominican brother Imbert, was returned to his lofty post as Grand Inquisitor of France, although there is no indication that the torture of the Templars had been stopped for even a single day during his brief removal from office. There were basically two types of medieval torture. First was the use of torture as punishment. The man sentenced to be chastised with pain had no way to stop the executioner that official burned him with a red-hot iron, cut off his nose, ears, or lips, or scourged him with a whip that was frequently tipped with metal. Not until centuries later would merciful authorities limit a flogging to the bare back between neck and waist. In the 14th century, the lash could be applied freely to any part of a man's body, including his face and genitals. The other type of torture was that applied to extract information or a confession. The governing factor was the constant reminder that with the right answers, the torture would stop. The victim had total control over how long the pain would last. If a man held out because he insisted on staying with the truth, or to prevent his being used as an instrument of betrayal, the pain could go on and on. Unfortunately for the Templars, they were questioned on so many different charges that if they admitted to one charge to stop the pain, they would soon find themselves screaming in agony as their jailers proceeded with the next question. Legally, torture by the Inquisition was to be limited to a single session, but the zealous friars developed the concept of a recess, or adjournment that would permit them to torture a man for weeks under the claim that the whole time frame was just one session. The object of the Templar torture was clearly to extract confessions, but since a dead man can't confess to anything, it was very important that whatever the degree of agony inflicted, it should not bring death. There is no better indication of the enthusiastic brutality of the Inquisitors than the fact that 36 Templars died under their torture during the very first week. I'm going to pause for a moment here. So we see, excuse me. So we see what's been done here by this combination of King Philip the Fair and Pope Clement V to the Templar order. And we see how the Templars were brought down when they thought they were above the law. They were beyond reproach. They couldn't be touched. They were the untouchables. And they were serving the purposes of those organizations and people they were helping to hold up. That would be the church or the papal authority. And still, despite them doing their part for the papal authority, they were thrown under the bus because they became too much of a threat, were something to go wrong in the eyes of those who held sway over them. This is the nature of secrecy and of secret societies. This is the nature of evil. It cannibalizes itself, folks, and that's what had happened here. The Templars, they were not all innocent. The king and the pope, they were also not innocent. The Templars, it would appear from third-party sources that they were actually guilty of some of these heresies that they were accused of, that they did perform some of these things that they were accused of, and there's evidence that maybe they did practice the dark arts, because you see, the story goes that when Jacques de Molay was eventually burned at the stake, as he was dying, being burned at the stake, he pronounced a curse on King Philip the Fair and on Pope Clement that they would both die. And both of those men were dead within a year. So perhaps there was a practice of witchcraft or some such thing going on within the Templar order. But of course, de Molay is held up as a very noble figure in modern-day Freemasonry. They have a whole organization named after him, and this is the ironic part, because de Molay, along with some of the other Templars of the time, was accused not only of homosexual acts, but of defiling children. That was part of the charges that were brought against the Templars. So it seems probable that de Molay and some of the various other Templars did abuse children. And the bitter irony of all of it is the Freemasonic organization has a sub-organization under it called the de Molay Society, which is specifically designed to bring children into Freemasonry. This is for the sons of Freemasons. And this organization is right here in plain sight today, the Order of de Molay. They initiate children into the mysteries. Isn't that a bitter pill to swallow, that the organization is named after a probable pedophile? And this is one of the things that undergirds so much of our culture and society today, and especially the establishment of these occult fraternities that seem to run things in this world and direct things. Pedophilia lies at the heart of a lot of it. And it's out there in the open, in plain sight. If you understand history, if you've ever explored history in any regard, you can know a little something about some of these organizations. But most people don't have a friggin' clue because they don't bother to look into it. Most people wouldn't understand what's a de Molay. Who's Jacques de Molay? What is this organization? What is this Order of de Molay under the Freemasons? I thought it was just a group that does nice things like hold spaghetti dinners and give money to children's hospitals and has a little country club or something you could belong to and you could get a square deal down at the car dealership. No, there are spiritual underpinnings beneath all of that surface veneer. And most people are so ignorant of that, they don't have a clue. And all it takes is a little curiosity if you wanted to read up on this stuff. If you were interested, if you had any inkling of interest about anything in this world that's presented to you, you could find this information yourself with very little problem. The problem is people don't care. They're not curious enough. They don't care to look into the details of how certain things came about. For instance, exactly what we're talking about here. Friday the 13th. Where did this legend come from? Where did the archetype come from? Well, here it is. If you've ever been curious about, wait a minute, why is Friday the 13th considered so unlucky? Why is the number 13 considered unlucky? Where did all of this come from? Well, this is where it comes from. It comes directly from the Knights Templar and their reckoning day. And this is something that is of monumental importance to the other secret society groups, especially Freemasonry. They understand the impetus of what this is. And they use this as a focal point for extracting their revenge on society at large, or the church, if you want to call it that. That's why they have a big chip on their shoulder when it comes to Christianity. They blame the Christian church. They blame Christianity for the downfall of the Templars, whom they see as their forebears. When you begin to understand this, then you begin to understand why there's so much contention in our modern culture and society against Christianity. Not only as a religious organization, but as a philosophy, as an identity. They don't like anything Christian. That's why they've tried to remove Christ from everything. Instead, they give you a false Christ in its place, even within the secret society groups. They give you an alternative Christ. They think Christ is an office or a position. Christ consciousness, it's something you could achieve. Not the actual incarnate living Son of God, God incarnate here on earth in physical form, come here to manifest and experience the full experience of being human, what we all feel, what we all go through and deal with. They don't view it in that way. They give you an alternative to that, an alternate Christ, an antichrist, if you will, in the secret society groups, and they have nothing but disdain for Christianity because they see it as a perversion of the ancient mystery school teachings, and they see the actions of things that were done in the past in the name of Christianity as a perversion and as a direct attack on themselves, and they are seeking revenge for that. And thus they give justification to themselves for lying to you and misdirecting you and steering you in certain directions, handing you Gnostic beliefs, thinking that somehow knowledge will save you. This is what's become of this, and all of this has its roots back with the Templars, and even before that. But this whole notion of Friday the 13th, this archetype that's come about because of that, this ties directly back to those events. Friday, October 13th, 1307, the arrest of the Templars and their downfall, their reckoning day. The destruction of that old order of Templars and the arrival of a new order in their place. The rebirth, the phoenix, if you will. The number 13 represents the phoenix, the death and the rebirth through fire. And how were many of the Templars executed? They were burned at the stake, much like de Molay. So when you begin to attach all of the esoteric undercurrents to this, you understand the importance of this archetype and why I'm actually talking about it. Because we're sitting at a time period where we have very closely together two Friday the 13th surrounding an election cycle in November. And I would not be surprised if some important event happens on November 22nd of this year. Just putting that out there. I hope to be wrong about that. But I would not be surprised if something were to happen on that date. I don't know the true nature of what that would be or what that would look like, but I would not be surprised if some important world-changing event happened on November the 22nd this year. Simply because it falls between that date range, between these two Friday the 13th of this year. And we have this important election going on in the beginning portion of November. So take that how you will. Like I said, I reserve the right to be totally wrong on that, and I hope I am wrong. But there's a reason they utilize these archetypes. There's a reason why Friday the 13th has been in the attention of people within the past week or so. And it has more to do with the archetype being present than it does that the actual date came up and it was Friday the 13th. Everybody acknowledges that to some degree. But this one was special because there was some type of a partial eclipse or some such thing that occurred on that day as well. So there's significance here. And it's a harvest blood moon eclipse on Friday the 13th. So there are occult connotations attached to that, and I think that those dark powers that run this place will try to leverage that to some degree. And that's why I think it's important that we look at this and we understand what Friday the 13th as an archetype is all about. And I think it's important that we turn the tables on these very hubristic and arrogant dark occultists who like to leverage this stuff against us and remind them they're not above reproach. They're not above the law. They are not out of reach, as they may think they are in their hubris. That perhaps the same fate that happened to the Templars could await them. Just putting it out there, folks, because I think it's important that we discuss these things. And you have the right to totally dismiss it all as nonsense if you'd like. Regardless of whether you believe any of that stuff or not, is irrelevant. The occult concepts behind this, of course, I'm referring to the energetic archetypes present. You can ignore all that and say it's nonsense if you'd like, but I assure you there are people in positions of power in this world that very much believe in these things, and the things they do to act upon their beliefs in these things will affect all of us. So it's important that you understand it, whether you believe it or not. That's the bottom line with all of it. Anyway, that's all the time we have for tonight, folks. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I'll remind you I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll catch you next time. Have a good one now. Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit. Accept no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.